Hello again, art history students. Welcome to Prehistoric Art Lecture. This is Unit 2, Lecture 1. At the moment I am recording this, I'm not 100% sure how many lectures will be in this unit. I try to keep things kind of at a smaller 30-minute-ish for each lecture sort of thing, so we won't, I'm not 100% sure how many, but they're all up on Blackboard. So let's get right to it. In the last unit, specifically the last lecture of the last unit, talking about types of analysis, we talked about contextual analysis. That was kind of the all-encompassing way of which you look at a work of art, where you're looking at all of the historical factors, all of the individual who made the artworks, identity, their social political status, where they lived in the world, all of the history that went along with that. All those kinds of things are brought into contextual analysis. And that's what we're going to strive for as we move forward with this class. We're going to look at artwork in a semi-chronological kind of band, we'll say, and then we're going to kind of bounce around the world a little bit, but we're going to try to go for that chronological um, order, and then um, trying to put all of these artworks into their context so that you have a better understanding of what you're seeing. So we're going to talk about the earliest art, and this earliest art is just sort of like these relief handprints that are here, and they're sort of like a signifier of identity a little bit, this human identity. And then we're going to see how art develops a little bit. So I want to put into context what the lifestyle of people is like at this time. So there's Paleolithic and Neolithic, but we'll get to that in just a moment. But the world is much colder. Water levels are very low. The oceans are not as big. Most of the earth is covered in ice. People are able to kind of migrate between land continents. People are migratory in the fact that they're following herds of animals, hunter-gatherers. They have three basic needs, and this will be important because most of the art is made for those three basic needs, which is food, shelter, and reproduction. And art at this time, and pretty much for the rest of history, can fall into two very general categories. And this is very, very general, which is stationary and portable. First, we're going to talk about stationary. So, like I said, the three basic things that people are interested in the world at this time, or the three basic needs of human beings, is food, shelter, and then reproduction or procreation. So let's talk about food sources for a moment and how art could kind of be the first communicator over time. So there are two basic theories sorry, there are two basic theories about how art um, kind of got started in this really early Paleolithic period. So the first one is that when a group of hunters would come back to the group, right? So to this sort of like tribe that they lived in, for lack of a better term, or more than likely just sort of the family unit that they lived with. And they would recount the story of the hunt that had just happened. Remember, there's no entertainment of any kind at this time. There's certainly no YouTube, but you know what I'm saying? There's no other entertainment. This is Paleolithic man. So this would have been a big deal to hear this story. And they more than likely kind of drew these drawings along with it as part of that storytelling process. Then the theory kind of goes that over time, so you have this drawing that's from last time you went on a big family hunt, and you could say to this guy, like, hey, Bill, remember how last time you went this way? Well, now we want you to go this way, and that way, we'll get around the animals in a different way, or whatever the case may be. And this implies a plan. This implies that this group of people is planning in advance. And that means that these drawings are kind of the very first, the very beginning of communication over time and generations. So you could also look at the image that your grandfather made and said, well, that was grandpa, and this is how they did it, so we'll do it in a similar way or we'll improve upon it, right? And the ability to improve upon abilities and techniques is one of the things that sets human beings apart from all the other animals. So I won't talk too much more about that, but just try to remember those theories that the first that came was kind of that these were a storytelling apparatus, and then from that storytelling was the ability to plan and evolve and make better decisions as a community. All right, so this is X-ray kangaroo rock. This is in Australia. Right? So the previous image that we looked at would have been in Paleolithic Europe. And this one is from much farther into the future, right? So roughly 1900, so much newer. But there's something really interesting about this artwork that I want to point out. So this is part of the Aborigines, which are the native indigenous people to Australia. And this is part of their storytelling process. And they have what they call the Mini, which is the spirit who taught animals to hunt and paint. And it's not, I think that this really further bolsters that whole importance of art as an original communication, right? Why would there be a spirit or a god or a creature from the sacred realm, for lack of a better term, who would put these two things together? We really don't normally associate hunting and painting as hobbies that one person would share, or why would they be together, right? So I think this really bolsters that theory that that's what these early cave paintings were about. All right, so here is a series of questions that I want you to consider as we go forward. So this term Stone Age, which is pretty much the bulk of what this little lecture or section of this unit is about, and I use the terms Paleolithic and Neolithic to decipher them, and we'll talk more about why, but the main thing to remember is that there's no written records. Human beings did not have ceramic technology and they did not have metallurgy, which means they have no containers or vessels of any kind to store their food in, to store grain in, to store any of that kind of stuff in. So everything that they're doing for a certain level of immediacy, right? When you get fruits and vegetables and harvest them from nuts, trees, or whatever, you have to eat them immediately. They're not going to keep, there's no refrigerators and stuff. And that's going to mean something when human beings get those two technologies, metalworking and ceramic technology. That means that they will then be able to store things, which means they can settle down a little bit more. That's kind of one of the big differences between Paleolithic and Neolithic. So on that note, what did the concept of art as we understand it exist to these people? Were these objects and drawings that they made, were they valued in the same way that we value them? Was their purpose strictly utilitarian? And what role did these images serve to the community? And I think that that's really important to think about, for you guys to think about as you approach this contextual analysis that we're using for the bulk of this class. Like, how are these objects seen by the people who created them, and what value did they place on them? All right, so the first place that we're going to talk about is Lascaux Cave in France. This area was a cave that was used, they believe that it would have been in like a pilgrimage site or a site that people would have returned to, or they know that they returned to it multiple times, probably through multiple generations, and came back there to create more imagery. And then it was sealed over, and then it wasn't until like the 1970s that this cave was actually unsealed and people were able to see all of these Paleolithic drawings. This is the rough kind of layout. The big areas that I want you to know for the test are this one, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and then the Hall of the Bulls here, which we're going to talk about first. All right, so this is the Hall of the Bulls in Lascaux Cave. And so this is a very large area, a very large depiction. This is slightly elevated. It's really difficult to get, this is not a big space, a big interior cave space. So getting an image, or at least finding images of kind of these caves, kind of like where the images are in context, is kind of difficult. But these are up on the wall a little bit, kind of where you would kind of be below them, looking up at them. And they're slightly larger than life bowls. This is a very large area, and we know that these would have been animals that they would have seen in their everyday lives. So if you remember back to the very first lecture, I talked for quite a while about that atlatl, the springing horse. It had a little horse on it, and we talked about that connection between the animal that the human being would have seen that would have had those attributes, right? The attributes of speed and power, which would have been the horse. So these animals are both food source animals, and they're kind of animals that are revered, right? They're part of the visual culture of the people who lived at this time. This is the figure of the horse, right? So we see some interesting things. We see some overlapping, right? We know that this leg is kind of in front of this other leg, which means that these, what we would kind of consider primitive people or early peoples, did have quite a bit of understanding of A, anatomy, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment, and B, kind of how things overlap. These aren't just super critical stick figures always. They're giving quite a bit of delicacy and detail to a lot of these images. Now, on that note that I just made about detail versus stick figures, this is something that's very interesting in these Paleolithic caves. So this man here, wait, let's get a different color that stands out a little bit more. This man here is a stick figure man. He's called the bird-headed figure. And then we see this bison, and this is the disemboweled bison. So we have this diagonal line here, which indicates a spear, probably would have been thrown from an atlatl, right, which has pierced sort of the entrail area of this bison, and then the innards are coming out. So what I want you guys to pay attention to is how much detail is put into this animal. We see areas where the hair stands up, like we do along here, this kind of bearded area, right? We see all of the details of the face and the head, where the eyes are, all those sorts of things. And then we also see details of the inside of the creature. So it's not that these human beings could not look at themselves or look at each other and realistically depict each other, right? But they chose to depict themselves, or to depict all human beings, or most of the time, as stick figures. They're given very little identity. That's not a super big part of the culture, right? If your primary concerns in life are survival, food, shelter, and reproduction, which is basically the survival of the species or of your group or of your family, you don't have a whole lot of time to debate your place in the universe or these other existential concerns, right? It's a very utilitarian existence, a very survival-like existence. And these animals are given so much more reverence rather than the human beings. And I think in part because they are the food source. They are what sustains people. So understanding this animal, right, the bison, understanding its insides, understanding how it can be brought down, right, understanding all those things are more important to survival of the group rather than understanding who this man is and who his identity is. That is not incredibly important information. So this work will probably be on your test, right? I'm 100% sure it is. So again, these cave artists never really drew landscapes, and they rarely portrayed the human figure. And officially that reason is unknown, but you just heard sort of my theory about importance and survival and what is essential information. That's what I would argue as to why these artists are paying so much more attention to these animals rather than to these figurative elements of themselves. So people are stick figures, animals usually are depicted very realistically. All right, here's another example. This is not from the Lascaux cave, but I just wanted to show this is another example of the kind of level of detail and understanding that they had about these creatures. So not only do we see these bison, which are carved of raw clay that was just kind of at the back of the cave, but we kind of have this we understand, or at least these artists understand, sort of the thickness of the muscle around certain areas where the animals are sort of thin and have joints, like would be in this sort of hip area, versus where the bigger cuts of meat and whatnot would be. So there is definitely a level of understanding. I think, especially with that term, which isn't really used in art history as much anymore, that primitive art or art that's, I think that we're just underrating what these artists found important and what was important to their lives. So again, this artwork is not from the Lascaux cave. This is another artwork that's not, this is from Sympathetic Cave. We're going to see a couple artworks from here now. We can also see this rhinoceros. This is also in France. So they would have been animals at this time. We see overlapping, right? We know that some of these animals are in front of and behind the others. And then another thing I want to point out is just imagine if you've ever sat by a fire or been in a strobe light, you know that sometimes things can have like a kind of in that flickering light, the way they look and the way they kind of have this sense of motion and movement. So we know that these drawings often go along with some kind of storytelling process. And I want you just for context, just to put yourself in that moment, think about what this might look like with a flickering flame light rather than this static light of camera. Right? These objects might almost come alive slightly, like move a little bit. So I think that kind of elevates that storytelling and that entertainment value. All right. So next I want to put forward this kind of question. This is from the same cave, the Chevet Cave in France. And this is I could not find, like I said, I have a hard time finding good pictures of this. This is kind of the floor here. And if you see the way this artwork is all presented in this line, almost like it can be read like text. So is this art? Is this writing? Is it both? Is it a precursor? Right? So just thinking about those kinds of questions as we talk about this artwork. Okay, next we're going to move on from stationary art to portable art. Portable art should be kind of self-explanatory, that you can take it with you, unlike stationary art, which stays at the cave. And I mentioned when I said the Lascaux caves that there would have been kind of like returns to them. I don't want to use pilgrimage sites as a term, which we will define that later in this class, but these people are traveling with animals, which are often going back to the same place, to the same areas to feed year after year. So people are also returning to the same areas. But portable objects would go with them on their travels. And not a whole lot of these survive, just because sometimes they're made of things like bone and antler. And then if they were made with clay, they oftentimes weren't able to be fired. So they weren't able to survive. But the stone ones often do survive. And these are figurative, and they are a little bit more recognizable. So on cave drawings and cave paintings, figurative elements are kind of not so much. It's just stick people. But when it comes to portable art, there are a lot more figurative elements. So this artwork, I'm not going to talk about it because there's a whole long, I talk about it for like 5 minutes in that very first little video, which should still be up, and you guys can watch that if you need a refresher. But I just want to quickly this artwork combines those ideas of this creature, which they see in their visual culture, the horse, is both strong and powerful, and those are the attributes that they want for their spear and the atlatl. So it's trying to merge those attributes and those ideas. So let's take that thought process and move to the next artwork. So this is the Woman of Willendorf. If you ever get like a really old textbook or something, it might say the Venus of Willendorf. That's kind of a name that is no longer used for this. So this object is only about, yay big, right? Roughly about the size of your hand, like this, 11 centimeters. It probably more than likely had feet that were coming down from there that would have made it just ever so slightly larger. But it's a very handheld object. It's an object that you can kind of hold, right? So if the atlatl and the springing horse was combining these two attributes from something that they would have seen in their environment that had those attributes and combining it with something that they wanted, what can you imagine this object is about? So first, let's talk about what attributes we see. We don't really see a face, right? There's just kind of these little squiggles. So there's this anonymousness to the identity of this woman. But what she does have is these very large breasts, very large, kind of wide hips, right? Which are good for giving birth, right? So they believe that this is a fertility figure, right? These people in Paleolithic Europe and the Paleolithic world have three basic needs, right? Food, shelter, and reproduction. So reproduction would be something that you would want. You would want the ability to have wide hips so that you could give birth and survive that birth process. And then these large breasts so that you could feed your baby and your baby would be healthy and prosper and continue the family and the, tribe or culture, however you want to say that, right? This basically continuation of the species. So I think that this is, again, very telling and also really kind of, you can see how this is further evidence of that anonymousness of the face, right? That is not important. The identity of this woman, the identity of you who carry this object, whoever you may be, is not important. It's these attributes that are trying to be merged together. So there's a very specific term for this attribute combination that I keep talking about. And that term is sympathetic magic. I think that is a terrible term. I just want to put that out there. I think that this is just a very, I don't know. I don't even like saying it. But sympathetic magic is basically the sympathetic relationship that objects have to attributes and then to the object that's represented. And basically what it is it's an attempt to gain control over the environment through magic, through ritual, through the use, right? And one thing that's very important about sympathetic magic is it represents abstract thinking. It represents the ability to say that and that are not connected and not the same, but I wish they were, or I will somehow bring them together, right? That's abstract thinking, which again is one of the things that helped human beings get to YouTube, right? So let's keep going from here. So here are just some other examples of more Venus figures or women figures, right? These fertility figures. We can see again that there are kind of these wide hips in the depiction and then this kind of anonymousness of the face. There's only a few that have had more detailed faces, and this one is one of them. I'm gonna mispronounce this, but the Woman of Brasimphony, which is also in, I think it's right on the edge of France and Germany. But anyway, it's even though that we see this kind of slight more, they're still not individualized features. This is still kind of a semi-anonymousness to it. And that thing that looks like hair is actually believed to be some kind of hood or shroud or something like that, which may also indicate the individual's status within society. Okay, So now I want to ask you everything that you know about sympathetic magic, everything that you know about hunting, right, and the importance of hunting to these people, and sort of the uh, fusion, right, the sympathetic magic. What do you think of this object? What do you think this object is communicating? Just so you know, it's a lion-human hybrid, right? It has kind of the body of a man and the head of a lion. So let's look at it a little bit more in detail. So here are some more images. You can kind of see a side image, just so you know this was carved from a tusk of uh, like a woolly mammoth, right? So let's think about human human hybrids. We introduced that term zoomorphic a while ago, which is kind of this animal human hybrid or human with animal attributes or vice versa. Right? So if I was going to be an animal human hybrid of a lion specifically, I would not want a lion head. I would want like Wolverine claws, right? Especially if I was some sort of hunter. Um, that to me would be the way that I would want to go. But Paleolithic man has not done that. What they've done here, or this Paleolithic artist, I should say, did not choose the sort of claws or teeth of the lion, maybe the teeth a little bit, but they chose the head. And the head is known to be the center of where like thoughts come from, where ideas come from, where planning comes from. At this time in history, people are hunting in groups. Today we think of hunting as kind of a lone thing, right? You go sit in your tree stand or whatnot, and you're kind of waiting there alone. But at this time, it was certainly not the case. So people hunted in groups, lions hunt in packs. Lions are the best hunters, right? So what this person is trying to kind of merge together, or these ideas that they're kind of merging together, is I want to be the body of a human, right? Part of the human community, but have that group dynamic in my mind, have that sort of hunter ability in my mind. And so should my group of people, right? My family side. So that's a little bit of what you can see with this animal human hybrid here, this zoomorphic image. This may or may not be on the quiz. All right, so now we have kind of gone through Paleolithic Europe, and now we're going to the Neolithic, right? Which is the stage just after Paleolithic. So this is the transition from people being nomadic hunter-gatherers who follow groups and herds of animals and the seasons and whatnot a little bit, to living as farmers. So there's this stability, there's this staying in one place year round. So I don't want to imply that they stopped hunting or that there weren't people who were living nomadically at the same time in history that people were living this much more farming agricultural lifestyle. This was not like a switch that flipped overnight. But this did create new things, right? New surfaces, right? Larger things were being built. You could build and have things that were significantly more stable. There's also slowly but surely the ability for metallurgy is coming along, right? The Copper Age, and then clay and pottery, which means storing things for a storing foods and grain and seeds and stuff for a longer, prolonged period of time. All right, so here's a nice little graphic which shows sort of the bowls of the Hall of the Bulls in Lascaux Cave, and then Stonehenge. So difference between Paleolithic and Neolithic. So this artwork comes from the Neolithic time frame, and one of the things that reasons I want to put it in, because it actually comes from Turkey, so it's a slightly different area of the world, and it is a wall painting from a cave, is this depicts a volcano here that is erupting, and then this community that we see below it. Right, so this is a replica of it, but we can see how all of these things are kind of gridded off like houses, which really kind of goes to show that these Neolithic people are living in a very similar way to how we live now, in close proximity to each other with basically a grid pattern in place. So that's not always the case. That's not 100% the case. But people are starting to congregate into larger groups at this time. So it's not so much individual family or small tribe or this sort of smaller group dynamic of survival. The group survival expands to a larger population. All right, so this is Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain in England. So what this object is basically a large, it helps track the cycles of the sun and the moon, right? Basically the equinoxes and the solstice, right? So this tells the difference between when days are going to get shorter, meaning winter, and when days are going to get longer, meaning spring and summer and the crop season, when things are going to be able to grow. That is the purpose of Stonehenge when it was created. And then it was used for a very, very long time. They're ancient alien people and stuff. They got other theories about it, but trust me, it's for understanding the cycles of the sun and the moon and the cycles of the seasons, right? Because that's important to know if you're a farmer and you're dependent upon agriculture. It's no longer just, look, all the buffalo are leaving, we've got to go follow them. It's much more, you have to know what's about to happen so that you can plan for the head. So planning is still very important. All right, how is this constructed? This is a post and lentil construction. If you're thinking to yourself, why do I need to know this for the art history class? Just so you know, we're going to track kind of the uprising and upgrading of architecture until we reach the Gothic era with Gothic cathedrals. So this is kind of the very beginning, and this is kind of like a side education or a sideline to all of the other art. And it will kind of reach this amazing pinnacle with Gothic architecture. So there are two terms here that you need to know, which is post and lentil construction, which is basically these top parts are lentils. These are posts. You are able to create a span in between them. This is how doors and windows are framed in our houses today. And then the next word that you need to know is monolithic, meaning carved from one piece of stone. All right. So this is Stonehenge uses post and lentil construction. Probably going to be a test question about that. All right, here is another image of Stonehenge, and you can kind of see the idea of how when the sun would rise at a certain location, you could see it from a certain place within the circle. You knew that then the days were going to start to get longer or shorter or whatnot. So this is kind of gives you a good idea of how it was used. All right, moving on. So one thing that I want to point out with this last little section of this lecture, we're going to shift gears and we're going to shift places. So this term Neolithic and kind of this term Paleolithic happens in different places at different times throughout the world. So agriculture, for example, kind of grows and becomes much more apparent in Mesopotamia, which is what we're going to talk about next, earlier than it does in Europe. So this time frame is not set in stone. I just want to tell you that with this class. So we're going to go to Easter Island, and we're going to look at a Neolithic culture there, which happened at a much different time frame, much later than it would have happened in Europe proper, right? England and the Salisbury Plain and all that kind of area. So now we're going to Easter Island. If you're not familiar with Easter Island, it is a small island off the coast. That's kind of a strong term, off the coast of Chile, which is in the Pacific Ocean. So this island is very isolated physically from other places in the world. And it's famous for these monolithic stone sculptures, which we just learned this vocabulary word, right? Which are called the Malwa. Right? So these are the ancestral figures. They line the entire outside of the island. Their backs are to the ocean and they face in towards the land. So these represent individual people. That's a big thing to note. These are specific ancestors. Each one of these sculptures is made to represent a specific individual. This is very different than what we would have seen in Paleolithic times with especially the woman of Willendorf, where she kind of has this very anonymous face. These are very specific people. All right. Here is the way that these were created. So I think this is important to note. And if you're thinking, why is she even telling us this? This is important. So this island is a volcanic island. All right, so I'm drawing a little volcano here. And then when it erupted and was created, the island was created, there are these flows of magma that happen. And when they're coming out, they get hard on the top, but then they flow underneath of it. So there are actually these tube-shaped rocks going all throughout the island, which were those magma flow tubes, right? Where if oxygen would have gotten to the top layer, it would have hardened a little bit sooner than the underneath. So this shape of these stones is natural to this island, this kind of cylindrical shaped stone. And that's what they would have carved these ancestor figures out of. If they did not make it to the coastline, if they took, because most of them, like I said, are kind of up here in this sort of top area of the mountain where the magma would have flowed down. There aren't as many of these shaped stones sort of near the, we'll say the water line is here. Look at us drawing. All right. Anyway, so as they would have brought the statue that they created, as they would have brought it down here to the coastline, if it didn't make it, if it fell or toppled over before it got there, they just left it. It was part of the symbolic ritual of that ancestor has passed. If his statue then makes it to the coastline, he then kind of watches over the people, right? The people of Easter Island. If he doesn't, or she or whatnot, if they don't make it to the edge, then their, their spirit or whatnot is not going to be one of the ancestors that watches over the island. So we will talk more about ancestors and ancestor worship and sort of the purpose of ancestors in early culture when we talk about Bronze Age China, which will also be this unit. All right, so here is another example of that fallen ancestor spirit or ancestor figure, I'm sorry. And again, these are specific ancestors who were chiefs and they have unique and general characteristics. So they have some elongated characteristics, right? Like these earlobes and whatnot, but sometimes some of them have wider noses and shorter noses and whatnot because of their unique individual features of whoever that chieftain was. All right, this is the largest one. Again, these are monolithic. That might be something that you might want to make sure you remember for the test is these monolithic structures or sculptures. Right? So here are all of the vocabulary words that you need for this little lecture. And next time we're going to talk about Mesopotamia. Don't forget about your discussion posts and all the other stuff that might be due for this lecture and the next one. So email me if you have any questions.